Greetings to our YouTube channel viewers and podcast listeners. Today's conversation is dedicated to the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. It's a long history, so it's not possible to talk, to discuss about the whole period. So we are going to focus just into to certain points in this quarter of millennium. The person I'm talking with is from the younger generation of American historians. Actually, we are relatives, distant relatives. So I'm very pleased we can do that. So Gwen Lockman, she's working as a historian at a History Colorado Center in Denver, in Colorado. So, hello, Gwen.
Hi, Brian.
My first question is really from the very beginning. So we must start with the Declaration of Independence. How does American historians or historiography today characterize this declaration, for example, as a decision that keeps a political, economical power of people living in Americas? Or do they describe it as a kind of idea how to fulfill Declaration of Human Rights, Enlightenment processes in Europe? But this second part, I think it's not the correct one. Or you will correct me, because a certain amount of people in states were not included, slaves, I mean.
Well, I think the historiography at this point is some of each of those things, while acknowledging the contradictions therein. So this is the Declaration is very much something that we discuss as historians as part of the Enlightenment, as a real divergence from the idea of being an English subject to being an American citizen, and the differences between the divine right of kings and the reasoning of the people, the rights of people. Mind you, that in, of course, the 1770s, the thought of those people being men, being Anglo-European men for the most part. So it did exclude a lot of people, but nonetheless, it was a more expansive view of who could participate in and who could know what the role of government was, rather than, a selected peerage or only a parliament, or of course only a king or a church. So in that regard, it's very much something that we still discuss as a product of the Enlightenment. The men who crafted the Declaration of Independence and who signed it were very much thinking about their relationship to the Enlightenment and their education and accomplishments as worldly thinking men. But of course, it was very much motivated by politics and economics. So for those more everyday Americans who are making their own protests against the English crown at this time, who are starting to think of themselves as Americans rather than Englishmen, they are very tired of the taxes imposed by the English crown as a result of the 7 Years' War, or as we typically refer to it in the United States as the French and Indian War in the 1760s. So that it was something that, so many elements of American life then became taxed. Tea is, of course, the one that becomes very famous because of the Boston Tea Party, but it's also paper and stamps and a number of other things. And so one of the ways that more everyday Americans start thinking of themselves not as Englishmen, but as Americans, is by boycotting English goods, by not buying new things with heavy taxes imposed upon them. And it's related very much to the politics of why should we pay taxes to a government that doesn't represent us? So without seats in parliament, with an ocean in between the realities of the English and those living in the colonies in the United States, there really was a large gap. The other issue is very much about land and war. So with the conclusion of the French and Indian War, there is sort of still this Western border to the colonies that that certain colonists want to push further out against. They don't want the Native American tribes to continue to have right and title to that land. They don't want to have to deal with the French. They don't want to be limited by the English crown. They want to push forward and do whatever it is they really want in a lot of ways. And so there's a confluence of different ideas floating around at the time of what it means to separate from England, some for whom it is more the idea of individual economic and political freedom, and some for whom this is very much about the politics of a region, the rights of groups of people. And of course, slavery is the original sin of the United States in so many ways. And it was an issue upon which those men writing the Declaration of Independence, citing the Declaration of Independence, convening the Continental Congress, that it was an intractable issue. They couldn't hold themselves together as a group if they truly confronted what it meant to upend slavery. And even though the 13 colonies were separate governments, separate places, they were economically intertwined. And so even a Northerner who might look down upon slavery, who might recognize it as a violation of human rights, would also be aware of the fact that the Northern economy relied on the benefits of the slave economy of the South. There was no really coherent abolition movement. There were individuals or perhaps church religious groups who abhorred slavery, who spoke out against slavery, but there wasn't the sort of organized mass communication, political strength that would have, that ultimately develops in the middle of the 1800s to really bring about a counter movement. And I think what's so fascinating to the American public, to students, to many right now, is grappling with the individual opinions of men like Thomas Jefferson or like George Washington, who would write that they hated slavery, but that they couldn't do anything about it. It seems very difficult to believe that they couldn't do anything about it if they so hated it. Could they not have freed the people who they owned?
Yeah.
I think that's a place that people are very stuck on right now in a useful way. There's one historian, Jill Lepore at Harvard. She wrote a couple of very good books in the last few years, very long histories of the entire United States, one really about sort of the promises of the Declaration and one about the Constitution. And when she writes in These Truths about George Washington, she suggests that he really knew that everything that he did would have lasting effects for the presidency as an institution. And she sort of puts forth a theory that part of why he didn't free the people he enslaved, but was that it might create the expectation that every president then after him would free the people who they owned. And that would again cause a political crisis that would not carry this experiment forward. I mean, it's an interesting theory. I'll want to see how other people engage with it. But I think it is an uncomfortable truth that historians are still grappling with how to deal with. It's something that in the past was really more accepted as fact than something questioned. And we're in a phase of questioning it. And I don't exactly know where it's going to lead.
You already mentioned the idea of go west. Can you evaluate a little bit more about that? Why? Because, I mean, the number of people living in colonies were not such a big one that it really would need a large amount of new land. So what was behind going west?
It's, of course, a big refrain in American history, and it's something that that doesn't necessarily, yeah, like you mentioned, it doesn't seem like maybe it was necessary, that there weren't that many people, that there was enough land. There are a couple of things I like to point to when thinking about this question. One is the competition of empire. So before the United States were the United States, of course, they were English colonies, and Spain was in North America and South America, and France was in North America and the Caribbean, and Russia was trying to push down into North America. And then, of course, there are all the native nations and their empires, all competing for land. So some of it has less to do with need for land than it has to do with relief from conflict, from the pressures of other empires. And in many ways, the United States is not really an empire yet, when it is a new nation. That's part of why it's grasping for more, though, is to really be established internationally, to gain legitimacy, to prevent the loss of land. I will say one thing that I don't think Americans think about terribly frequently is the War of 1812, when England took its chance at taking back the United States. But that was a very real threat for those first 50 years of the new nation. And so in part, it's about control and security. It's also very much about trade. So making the United States expand to the Mississippi River, which is a very big artery of a waterway that connects up to the Ohio River. Those waterways were very important for economic prosperity, connecting to New Orleans and St. Louis, which were very old French establishments. There's also what we really refer to as the idea of manifest destiny. And I think of this as very connected to Thomas Jefferson himself. So he becomes the third president of the United States. He's responsible for the Louisiana Purchase, securing way more land to become part of the United States than had existed as the United States thus far. So purchasing that land from France. And he, in part, is very interested in the resources available on the continent. So when he writes notes on the state of Virginia, one of his more famous texts, besides, of course, the Declaration of Independence, he speaks at great length of the natural resources of America and why that is so important compared to what is available in Europe. And he is motivated by making sure that those resources remain in control of the United States. And he's also a man of science who is very curious to know what exactly is out there. I think we always have to remember that much of the myth of America has to do really going back to Columbus and the idea of passage and what's on the other side. This is a time when maps are maps are always very important political tools, but I think we take for granted now what it is to know the entire map. They didn't know how far it went necessarily, or they didn't know what it would take to get across. Thomas Jefferson sends out the Corps of Discovery, which is a military expedition to map the entire continent, its waterways, its mountain ranges, its resources, the people who are already there, especially the native tribes. Although in so many ways, the Americans are late to the game. They meet tribes who already know Frenchmen, they meet tribes who already know the Spanish. So that's part of trying to catch up, secure the resources, catch up to the other empires, gain control over the natural resources and the economic opportunities that come with it. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that even though the United States is establishing a government without religion, it is still very rooted in Western thought, in Christian ideology. And so there is very much an impulse that it is the sort of divine command toward man to conquer the land, to tame it, to go forth and multiply, and to spread Christianity among the tribes. And then, of course, there is the issue of slavery. Slavery pushes a lot of political pressure west. So anytime Americans are spilling over west, the question of will they be able to own slaves in that territory comes up. And the United States avoids conflict over the issue for decades by admitting 2 states at a time, one that allows slavery and one that does not. I should also add that there are plenty of people in government who are dealing with the push westward of Americans as a problem, not as a positive. where they're trying to control the establishment of territories and new states, and that people just keep spilling over into land they're not supposed to go into. And some of it is people trying to get out of the United States. So when the independent Republic of Texas is its own country, those are people who do not want to be in the United States, and they try to take land from Mexico. They ultimately are successful to some degree and then end up rejoining the United States. So it's kind of a mess if we're really thinking about it. It's not all really well planned out. But even then, during the Civil War in the 1860s, sometimes people like to separate out of, well, the West was a different issue and the Civil War was about North and South, but the Civil War was very much about the West. A really terrific scholar, Megan Kate Nelson, wrote a book a few years ago called The Three-Cornered War, which looks at the Civil War in the American Southwest, noting that the Confederacy and the United States and Mexico were all fighting over what would become Arizona and New Mexico. That was contested territory. Mexico wanted that land back. They had lost it in the Mexican-American War. Of course, the Union didn't want the Confederacy to control any land, and if they could cut off the Confederacy to the west, they could perhaps contain them more. And the Confederacy had its own manifest destiny of wanting slavery to expand, to protect that economy to every extent it could. And there was a vision for a transcontinental railroad that belonged to the Confederacy that would have run from Atlanta, Georgia to Southern California. So the West is very much at the center of all these issues. I'll stop there.
Well, let's go forward for a few decades to the last decades of the 19th and the beginning of 20th century. It's the period of huge immigration to United States. Your family was also part of this because your great-grandfather and great-grandmother, they came from Slovenia. How United States were changed because of this immigrations, I mean, because amount of people was enormous, millions of millions, year by year.
Yes, so we really see this surge after the Civil War, but I do always like to point out that as much as the United States is seen as very much a product of England, there have always been a lot of different people here for a lot of different reasons. In part, noting that the slave economy, the cotton economy, was very much global trade between Europe, Africa, the Americas, and India for textile industry before the Industrial Revolution really took off in Europe or North America. Our oldest synagogues in the United States date to the 1600s. So it wasn't always English and Christian. There were lots of different people here. And I should also note that when people were being taken captive from Africa, of course, they are coming not necessarily with Christianity, many of them Muslim, many of them traditional African religions, cultures, and backgrounds. But you are right, of course, that it really changes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Part of this is that the country is bigger. Part of this is that there are railroads to move people. There are also efforts promoting the settlement of more and more land. So as you pointed out, there aren't always as many people demanding land as there is land available in the United States. And the Congress tries to promote populating the American West through a series of homestead acts. And so these provide essentially free land. Of course, this land is stolen from tribes, often in treaties, but sometimes they're really offering the land before it's entirely legal to do so. And if someone could come to the United States, go west, claim, I believe it was 80 acres first and then 160 acres, and work that land for 5 years, showing that they made agricultural improvements, that they had a home there, then they could keep that land. And that is attractive for many, many people, both immigrants within the United States and immigrants to the United States. There's a lot of very popular conversation, and you hear many people who are children descendants of immigrants from this time who talk about the economic opportunity. And much of this is in cities as well. So the American Industrial Revolution is ultimately disrupted by the Civil War and resumes following it. It is mostly a northern industrial revolution. So cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit really begin to grow at this point, and Pittsburgh, I should add, with steel. And so part of how this ends up changing the United States is very specific flows of people, of relatives going to similar places. So if we pull on our own sort of shared family story of my ancestors who went to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania first, and there was a Slovenian ethnic enclave there. And then I believe they go back to the old country to get married, but then come west to Montana for mining and smelting opportunities. It was very common that people would follow cousins or distant relatives or former neighbors, people who went to the same church, to the same communities. There would be publications, often newspapers with job ads that were in different languages to help new immigrants find work and establish communities. It's this period that really establishes places like New York City as it looks now, where there are Ukrainian neighborhoods or Jewish neighborhoods or African neighborhoods. But of course, most of the immigration is coming from Europe in the late 19th century. I should note, though, that this is also when the United States is creating its first real legislation limiting immigration. So a number of immigrants had come through San Francisco from Asia, especially from China, to help build the railroad and to seize opportunities in the mining West. Gold has always been a very motivating factor for people coming to the United States, or to North America, South America, I should say. And so there is a very large Chinese population and Japanese population that comes to the American West. And then beginning in 1875, that population is limited. First, the Page Act limits women coming from Asia. And then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act really limits the number of male Asian laborers coming to the United States. So I bring that up because as I name these ethnic neighborhoods, there are, of course, also Chinatowns, which are prevalent throughout the United States West and in its major eastern cities. But there is a starting of a cherry picking of who can come be a part of America. So even though the melting pot language comes from this era, so too does this distinction between who's really American and who will remain permanently foreign. And so it's at this time that very strong anti-immigrant political party motivation comes through. It's at this time that very strong anti-Catholic sentiment is very popular. And ironically, to some degree, or at least for us looking backwards, this is also when the United States starts reaching out. This is when the United States seizes control of the Philippines, of Cuba, of the Dominican Republic. So this is when the United States is really coming into its own as an empire, a global empire, to compete, to seize control of more places for economic benefit, for political benefit. And it's also at a time when the social sciences are developing alongside pseudoscience that is feeding into racism and eugenics, and suggesting that there might be an American race or a certain level of purity to what it means to be white. I think what is always really important to me in teaching these days is to point out that the fluidity of what ethnicity meant. It's an example that's especially relevant to contemporary American politics, that to be Mexican, to be Hispanic, to be Mexican American has changed meanings at least a dozen times. So when the United States acquires half of Mexico in the Mexican-American War, anyone who is in the territory that becomes the United States is given a year. They can either go to Mexico. It's not go back to Mexico, but it is go south to Mexico and remain Mexican. Or if they stay, they are supposed to be able to be American. And there's no classification on whether or not that is white or brown. And then there are different points where part of this is contending with a different racial stratification in the Spanish Empire and its descendants, as opposed to the American, where in the United States, there was a lot of concern over Black and white. And in the Spanish Empire, there are different mixes, essentially, of race that the United States is just not really prepared to handle. But at different points, to be Mexican American is to be more or less American. In California, there's a point where Mexican American miners are kicked out of mines because they are foreign, even though they never moved, that the border moved over them. They then stay in the United States to become American citizens, and then they are kicked out of mines for being foreigners. Similarly, there are a number of Catholic ethnicities, especially Italian, Irish, and Slavs, who are not considered white for a very long time. And then they eventually are, because the meaning is not fixed. It's based in cultural animosity and pseudoscience. So this is an interesting point of where it also coincides with the centennial of the United States in some ways, of passing that 100-year mark of what does the United States mean at 100 years, at a time when new people are coming and definitions of what it means to be American are becoming very, very contested.
Allow me a very personal question. In your family, different generations, how do they feel their attitudes towards their origin or towards being American? For example, your grandparents, how do they feel their connections to their relatives 2 or 3 generations back? How long do they keep this idea of becoming American, not being at the beginning? Or how is today? Is today this also the same, or it's changed and now it's a kind of a fashion? I'm American Irishman, or I'm Iro-American or Italian American. So what's the situation nowadays? Especially because of this fluid times in 21st century where people are trying to catch something to hold, but it's difficult to find something to really hold on.
Yes, I grew up very much hearing, your ancestors immigrated from Slovenia, from Ireland, from Prussia, on my father's side, and hearing very much, we were hardworking immigrants, and we are Americans now. And it is, my family ultimately came to an area in the West, Anaconda, Montana, that very much had those ethnic enclaves, that very much you were Irish or you were Italian, and especially the parents and grandparents, but then the children would be very much American. And so there are trends and habits in my own family that in traveling the United States in my adult life, I've learned are not necessarily common. So, whether it is making porizza every Christmas, or whether it is spending a lot of time talking about St. Patrick's Day in March, that's not a universal experience. That is something that my family does to stay connected to that heritage. I learned mostly about these connections to being of immigrant descent from my grandparents, and it was their grandparents who came to the United States. So it was their grandparents who didn't speak English, or it was their grandparents who missed the old country. It was their grandparents who taught them where they came from. And I think it's very common to see in American families, in what we study as historians, that the second generation ends up either one of 2 trends: becoming very much quickly assimilated and proving that they are American to prevent that foreignness from sticking, or you see someone who lives between 2 worlds. My new husband, his grandfather had to speak Italian and English. He had to work very young to be able to support his family. He had to help his Italian father, who didn't speak much English, navigate this world very specifically. So those are some of the trends you see. I would say in my own family, you see very much that second generation being very American. And then I think it's really after World War II that there's more embrace of what it is to be Italian American, what it is to be Irish American, what it is to be Slovenian American. Although even then, I remember my grandmother teaching me geography when I was very young about the map and saying, well, you're from what was Yugoslavia, and now it's Slovenia, and then it was this, and it was sort of confusing to try to understand a post-Cold War map as the map changed. And so then, deciding what exactly to call traditions. But there are many things that are lost. I don't know. I wasn't raised with songs or necessarily textiles or fashion from immigrant communities. It was much more just knowing your identity and knowing holidays or being aware of some of the history. But in many ways, it actually becomes more about being not Slovenian, but Slovenian American, not Irish, but Irish American.
You already mentioned the globalization of the United States in late 19th and the beginning of 20th century when you were talking about immigration. So twice in 20th century, United States, let's say, intervene globally in First World War and the Second World War, and after Second World War, they remain to be the global, one of the two global superpowers. Were the reasons in both times the same, economic, political, or there are just similarities, or there is just two separate different cases?
I would say that they are similar but different, and they are in part very driven by in some ways the personalities of the presidents in each of those time periods. And so when World War I rolls around, the United States is very isolationist, and Woodrow Wilson campaigns on being a president who will not enter the nation into war. It is ultimately, in both cases, military attacks on Americans that are used as at least the public catalyst for why the United States enters the war. So in World War I, it's submarine warfare from the Germans interrupting American shipping and killing American civilians on the Lusitania that becomes the justification, especially for Congress, to declare war and enter the United States into the war. And for World War II, it is Pearl Harbor. Now, the economic and political motivations for entering those wars are not necessarily exactly the same as the events that catalyze the public and catalyze Congress to authorize war. So when it comes to, I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit, so forgive me there, but when it comes to World War II, the attack comes from Japan, and it is the attack by the Japanese on Americans that really motivates joining the war. But Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has a very special relationship with Winston Churchill, and politically is very invested in helping protect European allies. So there's the need for sort of military retribution against Japan, but for an emerging idea of what the world order should be, what it has been, what should be protected, that's very tied to Europe. And I would argue that that is because of the prevalence of English control in North America before independence, and then those streams of European immigration being the sort of approved immigrants into the United States at this time. I would note that just as a historian and as a teacher of most Americans don't really understand World War I at this point and why the United States was involved or what the history of it really is. It's much easier for Americans to understand World War II. I think part of that is that, both of these military moments that catalyze entrance into the war, it's hard to understand for many people what it meant for American shipping to be attacked by German submarines. And it's World War I is something very much understood here as a deterioration of relationships between European nations. And so the other thing is, when it comes to memory of the war, the United States is so late to the war that even though there are a number of casualties, it's nothing compared to what World War I truly means for Europe. I will note one thing that I find particularly interesting about these questions of immigration and World War is what happens domestically during World War I. There were a lot of German immigrants to the United States. There were a lot of Irish immigrants to the United States. A lot of those people were not happy about allying with the English, especially. Especially for Irish immigrants Irish Catholic immigrants who were very anti-English. And then it's not to say that all German immigrants were in favor of the Kaiser, in favor of what was happening, but they were coded as foreign. And this is a time when the American government limits civil liberties and targets especially German Americans. German was one of the most common languages spoken throughout the United States West at this time. Actually, when Colorado, where I live now, becomes a state in 1876, the Constitution of the state is published in English, Spanish, and German. And I did my graduate studies in Texas, where there's huge German populations. And when you look at the communities before World War I, they spoke a lot of German. They celebrated a lot of German holidays. Their students in high schools had German clubs. They had German newspapers, and all of that ends with World War I because you could be arrested for sedition, for speaking against the government, for not supporting the war, for celebrating being German American. So that's just one example of the complications around memory with that war. And I think where people don't feel united in the experience of what that war was domestically. When it comes to World War II, it's very easy to understand the United States as the good cop, the good policeman. Even though actually when we think about the phrase to make the world must be made safe for democracy, that comes from World War I and President Woodrow Wilson. But that is something that is sort of proven with World War II, I think, for Americans to come in, to be of such aid in Europe, even though, again, the United States is quite late. They take a long time. First, they're providing money and artillery. It takes a while to really get boots on the ground in Europe. But it just feels so much clearer that American soldiers come in and liberate France, for example, and liberate the people from the concentration camps. That feels like a very clear win. And then I think people feel very justified about the war in Japan because of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is something that is very much still celebrated here, December 7th, every single year. And in part, it is the largest attack on American soil until September 11th, 2001. I would note Hawaii is not a state in 1941. It is a territory. It is a US territory. And I think it would be ignorant to suggest that motivations for American fighting in the Pacific Theater were not motivated by that exclusion that starts in the 1870s of Asian immigrants. Asian immigrants are permanently foreignized in the United States, and citizenship for Asian immigrants is not an easy thing to attain until after the 1960s. And so there is a motivation of this is a foreign body. These are foreigners in the United States. And again, I mean, slavery is the United States' greatest sin, but one of its terrible chapters is the rounding up of Japanese Americans and putting them in what were known as internment camps, which are essentially prisons in the United States desert throughout World War II. And so this is a time when the phrase, I am an American, takes on very strong importance as well. It is a refrain among especially the Japanese American community, especially among second generation Japanese Americans who were born here and therefore have birthright citizenship, many of whom then do enlist in the army if they can to fight in World War II to prove that they are patriotic. And there are lasting effects broadly in Asian American groups of tendencies towards more conservative politics, more anxious assimilation to prove Americanness, because for almost 100 years they were determined to be permanently foreign. So those are all very much a part of why the United States emerges from its isolation.
Well, we finished with winning in Second World War, so United States became one of the superpower. The second one was Russia. But how the average American saw the history of United States after World War II as a period of economic progress, prosperity, or through the eye of political superiority?
I think you're getting used to my answer saying these go hand in hand. I think it is first very much a military and political superiority, because so many people, do deploy from the United States in World War II. And even those who don't, women have a very limited role in the United States military in World War II, but it is a time where they become more involved in the workforce in the United States and are supporting the war effort. Most things domestically really turn towards supporting the war. And so victory in that war being something very existential and affirming that it is a democratic country with a very strong military that defeats fascism. But that is also paired with a new set of anxieties around how the war is ultimately won in the Pacific theater with the nuclear bomb, with the atom bomb. And so being a politically superior, militarily superior body in global politics then also adds to uncertainty, because it does position the United States up against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So military and political superiority is actually just really moving into its next contest. I would say for most everyday Americans, the economic benefit is really what is felt after World War II. And part of this has to do with running World War II up against the Great Depression of a time of such economic desperation in the United States, but also a time where the role of the federal government very much changes. Most people didn't really have to deal with the federal government before World War II, before the Great Depression, or at least you really hoped you didn't. And it is through the Great Depression and World War II that people start to receive Social Security benefits, that maybe more people are working for the federal government, that the federal government is involved in individual communities, whether that is helping to build schools or playgrounds or paving roads. As a result of World War II, I actually think roads are very, very important because the United States is a very big country and you have to be able to get around that country. And so the building of the interstate system of highways after World War II, it allows people to move around more easily. World War II itself moves people around the country a lot for jobs. It really populates the state of California in a new way. It makes Los Angeles a hub to rival New York City and Chicago in ways that it hadn't before. And so something as simple as buying a car, buying a house, that becomes very connected to what it means to live in the United States after World War II. World War II, post-World War II benefits for veterans of the Second World War also fundamentally changed the United States. Funding for education is provided at unprecedented levels, so more people are going to university, and aid in buying houses is provided to veterans in a way that it had never been provided before. And so that kind of economic access paired with mass production of consumer goods and a proliferation of advertising and American cultural products that now seem very familiar, radio, television, film, become extremely prevalent. They're everywhere. It's ubiquitous. You can't really sort of turn a corner without seeing American economic and cultural prowess. And the idea that the United States is a very successful republic, a very successful form of democratic government, and that it can go out and, so to speak, help other places be set up for that, drives so much of American geopolitics after that period.
But is this changing in the last 10, 15 years?
Yes, I've been speaking with my colleagues, my fellow historians here, about whether or not Americans have figured out what era we're in. Everything was post-World War II for a very, very long time. Even when the Cold War ended, it still seemed more connected to World War II than not. A post-Cold War era, I don't think we've ever really figured out what that meant, but post-World War II made sense. And in the last 20 years, we've exited that era, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And Americans aren't quite sure how to understand that yet. Is it simply the internet age? Is it the post-September 11th era? Is it post-Bush? Is it post-Obama? Is it the Trump era? What defines this moment now is a very unsettling question. And it's not really helped by how unsettled our culture and politics are, between faith in what the government can do and whether or not it is working, between what our history means and why it should matter, between who gets to be American and how they get to become American. I think it's very interesting how so many people descended from European immigrants, especially in that late 19th century period. They get into this idea of what it is to become an American the right way, as opposed to crossing a border illegally and that being the wrong way, without necessarily understanding that passports were not for everyday people in the 1900s. Those were for diplomats. Without understanding that, yes, there were screenings at Ellis Island, but there wasn't a citizenship test like there is now. It was very different. So yeah, I don't think Americans know what era it is. I think they're still clinging to ideas about post-World War II that actually don't really make sense for the United States anymore.
My last question is about education of history, because I know you're also dealing with teaching or education courses and so on. So my question is about average American and also a youngster who is already who is still in school. How much do they know about American history? I mean USA history, and especially how much do they know about anything else out of USA, meaning global history, European, ancient periods, because United States are 250 years old, but Europe's or Middle East civilization are thousands of years and so on. So how much in American educational system do they really get out of it, about this?
So in most states in the US, American history, United States history is taught in 5th grade, 8th grade, and at some point in high school. So this is around ages 10 and 11, 13, 14, and sometime between 15 and 17 years old. Those are the only times that there's a dedicated year towards studying the United States and its past. You'll see state history curriculum in 4th and 7th grades. So if you live in Texas, you study Texas history in 4th grade, or if you live in Montana, where I'm from, you study Montana history in 7th grade. So it varies region to region. History is very much education is very much determined at the state level, education standards. So I would suggest if you're from Massachusetts or New York, you have a big advantage in at least knowing American Revolutionary history, because you're getting it twice. You're getting, when you do United States history, you're learning a lot about your state. And when you do state history, you're learning a lot about what everyone else has to learn about United States history. Now, the funny thing is I'm from a fairly rural part of the nation, and I've had the privilege of traveling and living all over the country. And so even though I'm from the West, I did my university in the East. And I found that those students from the original 13 states hardly knew anything about the American West at all. I had to learn much more about their history than they had to learn about mine. So when it comes to actual numbers, I did go ahead and look up there was an assessment done in 2022 by the National Assessment of Education Progress, and they suggested that among 8th graders, so that's again 13, 14 years old, it's the end of primary education, that only about 18% of eighth graders tested in that assessment were proficient in United States history. So less than 1 in 5, fewer than 1 in 5 students was proficient in American history in 2022. And that was a decrease from their last assessment in 2014. I'd be remiss not to acknowledge how badly the COVID-19 pandemic interrupted American education. I anticipate that we will see somewhat of a lost generation for education on all levels for those students who were not yet, at least in university, before the pandemic. More anecdotally, at that point, I was friends with a number of people who were teachers, and it was just exceedingly difficult to adapt to online education for American students, for limited education, to keep up with standards coming from school administrators versus the realities of what students were dealing with. The previous generation, I know more closely just from my own experience and from speaking to people my age. But I would say that there's quite a limitation on how much Americans know their own history. Many Americans would not be able to pass the citizenship test required of new immigrants, frankly.
I think in our case might be the same.
Okay, good to know. When it comes to other histories, that's a pretty broad way to put it, but European history, world history is often only studied in periods of units in school, not entire years, unless a student self-selects to do that. Mm-hmm. So there are a number of different ways that secondary education operates in the United States, whether that is public school, whether among those public schools we have advanced placement programs or international baccalaureate programs. We have charter schools that are semi-public, semi-private. We have private schools that are religious, private schools that are not religious. And so there's a lot of inconsistency in a very large country over what those standards are. I would note, though, that most of the textbooks in the United States are written in Texas and California, and that those two states have very different politics, and therein very different perceptions of what should be included in United States history. And so Texas is far more conservative and California is far more liberal. And so a textbook from California might be more likely to invite frank and very detailed reflection on slavery. On those decisions made by Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, or what it meant to say that all men are created equal while also enslaving people. A textbook from Texas is more likely to try to be more celebratory about the American Revolution and just say this was a good thing. It was good. It's just not go far beyond that.
Period, and that's it.
Yeah. And you see those educational practices, you see those politics very much at the forefront of what is considered a current culture war. It's very interesting to take part in America 250, as we're calling it, the semi-quincentennial, at a time when we can't even agree on what our history is, and what our history should be, and what we should teach it, and what we should value, and what we should critique. Part of it is there's a substantial population who doesn't want any criticism. They think that it is unpatriotic. They think that it is divisive. They think it makes people not proud to be American. And they think especially that it's designed to make white people, which in current understanding being European and descended Americans, feel bad for things that aren't their fault. Those are some of the talking points for that view. And then there are those who say, well, the United States is an idea about living up to being a more perfect union, and we have to acknowledge all the things that have gone wrong, and we have to acknowledge all the structural systems that have limited people, especially from different racial backgrounds and different economic backgrounds, and we need to take responsibility for all of it, and we can't repeat any of it. And you can never forgive anyone who owned slaves. And it feels very impractical to bring those two people to the same table, to have those two people read the same book, because ultimately they are reading very, very different things, even when they look at the same text. But what I also point out to people who are asking, don't you feel that this is impossible? I point out that 1976, when the United States was celebrating 200 years, was not so different at all. I point out that 1876, only 10 years after the end of the Civil War, was not so different either. And so I say that not to be entirely pessimistic. I say that just to acknowledge that this is what it is to be American, is to disagree and to be unsure. And I hope that people here understand what a rich history there is to try to understand, to try to come to terms with, what it means to be grateful for the systems of government that we have here, for the freedoms that we do have here, without taking them for granted, what it is to understand that working towards something more perfect means it has never been perfect, and also means it never will be.
Gwen, thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your ideas. And I hope our listeners and viewers will enjoy our conversation. Thank you.
So do I. Thank you for having me.